A wedding photo from 1905 looks normal, but in the background, historians are shocked. What appears to be a simple celebration of matrimony hides a disturbing detail that experts are still trying to explain. The seemingly ordinary black-and-white image harbors a secret that has left even the most skeptical researchers baffled. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Sarah Mitchell sighed as she adjusted her glasses, carefully handling yet another brittle photograph from the seemingly endless collection at the Carnegie Library archives. The historian had spent weeks cataloging these faded memories of Pittsburgh's past, each one blending into the next, until this particular image caught her eye. The wedding photograph from 1905 showed a beaming couple on the steps of a Methodist church, their faces radiating the kind of innocent joy that defined the turn of the century. The bride's lace dress cascaded elegantly around her, while her groom stood proudly in his formal attire. Sarah smiled reflexively at their happiness, but as her eyes wandered to the background, her breath caught in her throat. There, partially concealed behind a marble column, stood a sharply dressed man with an intense gaze that seemed to pierce through time itself. Something about his face triggered an unsettling sense of recognition in Sarah, although she couldn't immediately place why. "That's odd," she whispered to herself, carefully lifting the photograph closer to the desk lamp. The man's posture conveyed a strange tension, not the typical stiffness of early photography, but something more deliberate, as if he were simultaneously trying to be seen and remain hidden. The historian's fingers trembled slightly as she placed the photograph on the digital scanner. After uploading the image to her computer, she enhanced the section containing the mysterious figure. His features became clearer, prominent cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that held a peculiar mixture of caution and defiance. "Who are you?" Sarah murmured, leaning closer to the screen. "And why do I feel like I've seen you somewhere before?" She cross-referenced the image with the library's database of prominent Pittsburgh families, focusing particularly on those connected to the steel industry. The search yielded nothing conclusive, but the nagging familiarity refused to subside. Sarah printed the enlarged section and pinned it to her research board. Something about this man's presence at the wedding felt significant, almost as if he were an uninvited ghost rather than a guest. The couple's joy contrasted sharply with his furtive demeanor, creating a visual dissonance that the trained historian couldn't ignore. As the afternoon light faded outside the archive windows, Sarah found herself unable to move on to the next photograph. This mystery had sunk its hooks into her professional curiosity. She began making notes, documenting every detail about the man's appearance, his positioning in relation to the wedding party, even the way shadows fell across his face. "I think you've been waiting for someone to notice you," she said to the image. The mystery felt personal somehow, as if this photograph had patiently endured a century of obscurity, specifically for her to discover its secret. Sarah Mitchell knew she needed an expert's opinion on her discovery. She reached out to James Hamilton, a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, whose research into the city's industrial dynasties had earned him national recognition. They agreed to meet at a quiet corner of the Carnegie Library, where they could speak freely. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice," Sarah said, carefully laying out the wedding photograph on the table between them. "There's something about this man in the background that I can't shake." James adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his expression curious but skeptical. As his eyes focused on the figure partially hidden behind the column, the transformation was immediate. The color drained from his face, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the photograph. "This is impossible," he whispered, his academic composure crumbling. "Sarah, do you know who this is?" "That's why I called you." she replied, watching his reaction with growing concern. "This is William Whitmore." James's voice was hollow with disbelief. "The heir to the Whitmore steel fortune, but he can't possibly be in this photograph." "Why not?" Sarah asked, though something in his tone had already sent a chill down her spine. "Because William Whitmore died in a laboratory explosion in 1903 Tyne," James explained, his finger hovering over the man's face. 2 years before this wedding was photographed. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. "Are you certain it's him? Could it be a relative, perhaps?" "I've studied the Whitmore family for 15 years, the professor insisted. "I've seen every existing photograph of William. That distinctive jaw, the set of his shoulders, it's him, without question." James pulled a notebook from his bag and began scribbling furiously. "If William Whitmore was alive in 1905, everything we know about the family's history changes. The explosion, the inheritance disputes, the rapid expansion of their steel empire after his death. It was all built on a lie." His urgency troubled Sarah more than his certainty. The historian in her recognized the academic goldmine they'd stumbled upon, but something deeper, a sense of trespassing on long-buried secrets, made her hesitate. "The Whitmore fortune shaped modern Pittsburgh," James continued, his eyes now bright with academic fervor. "Their philanthropic work, their political connections, all of it stems from the period after William supposedly died." Sarah studied the photograph again. The man, William, was watching the wedding party with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Was it longing, regret, or something more calculated? "If he didn't die in that explosion," she said slowly, "then what really happened to William Whitmore?" Sarah Mitchell spent the next 3 days buried in the Carnegie Library's basement archives, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and leather-bound death records. The musty scent of aged paper filled her nostrils as she traced her finger across the faded ink of the Pittsburgh Gazette's front page from 1903. The coroner's report on William Whitmore's death was troublingly vague. "Remains unidentifiable due to extensive fire damage," it stated. "Identity confirmed solely through personal effects recovered at scene, specifically a gold signet ring bearing the Whitmore family crest." Sarah frowned, noting how convenient this single piece of evidence seemed. She pulled another file. Police statements from workers at the laboratory. 3 witnesses mentioned seeing William enter that morning, but none actually saw him inside when the explosion occurred. Even more curious, a night watchman reported seeing 2 men arguing near the building just hours before the blast. Yet this detail appeared only in his initial statement, mysteriously absent from the final investigation. "This doesn't add up," she whispered, spreading the documents across the table. The official timeline claimed William had been working alone on a new steel tempering process, but expense receipts showed materials purchased for 2 researchers. Who was this second person? The reports never named him. Sarah found herself drawn to a small article buried on page 7 of the Gazette. Published 3 days after the explosion, it mentioned a Walter Morrison, described as a photographer of some repute, who had unexpectedly left town the same week. The coincidence made her pulse quicken. She called James Hamilton from the archive phone. "James, I need you to look into someone named Walter Morrison. He was in Pittsburgh when William supposedly died." "Already following another lead," James replied, his voice tense with excitement. The Whitmore family donated an enormous sum to the coroner's widow just months after the investigation closed. Seems our officials might have been persuaded to look the other way. Sarah's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments. William Whitmore, heir to one of Pittsburgh's greatest fortunes, had every resource needed to orchestrate his own disappearance. But why? What could drive a man of his standing to abandon everything? In the margin of one newspaper, she found a handwritten note that had survived the decades. second body, never explained. The words sent a chill down her spine. If William had escaped the explosion, someone else might have died in his place. A revelation that would transform a mysterious disappearance into something far darker. As Sarah gathered her notes, the weight of what she was uncovering settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just academic curiosity anymore. The Whitmore legacy, built on Pittsburgh's steel and sweat, might be founded on a carefully constructed lie, one that had held for over a century until she spotted that face in the background of a wedding photograph. Sarah Mitchell knew she needed someone with a direct connection to the Whitmore family. After days of research, she located Jennifer Whitmore Chen, a corporate attorney in New York and the last living descendant of the Steele dynasty. Making contact proved challenging. 3 emails and 2 voicemails later, Jennifer finally agreed to a video call. "I'm extremely busy, Miss Mitchell," Jennifer said when her face appeared on screen. Her sleek office backdrop and impeccable suit projected the polished image of a woman accustomed to controlling conversations. "I don't see how a century-old photograph concerns me." Sarah treaded carefully. "I believe I found something significant about your family history, specifically about William Whitmore." The attorney's expression hardened instantly. "William? My grandmother rarely spoke that name." Her fingers tapped nervously against her desk, betraying the composure she fought to maintain. "I understand this might be uncomfortable," Sarah continued, "but as a historian, I can't ignore what I've discovered." Jennifer's voice grew tense. My family doesn't appreciate having our past dissected for academic curiosity." She glanced at her watch. "You have 5 minutes." Sarah shared her screen, enlarging the wedding photograph. This was taken in 1905, 2 years after William's reported death, and Jennifer's tone remained dismissive, but her eyes had fixed on the image. "Look at the man behind the column." The attorney leaned closer to her camera, squinting slightly. Sarah watched as recognition dawned across her face, the same unsettling recognition James Hamilton had shown. "That's impossible," Jennifer whispered, her professional veneer cracking. "He died in the laboratory explosion." "Did he?" Sarah pressed gently. Jennifer's composure finally broke. She reached for a glass of water, her hand visibly trembling. "My grandmother, Margaret, she would never answer questions about him. When I was young, I found an old photograph album and asked about William. She took it away immediately. What did she say? That some stories were best left buried." Jennifer's voice had lost its edge. "She made me promise never to dig into it, said it would only bring pain to the family." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "Jennifer, I believe there's much more to William's story than what's in the history books." The attorney stared at the screen for a long moment. "My grandmother kept a cedar chest of her personal papers. I've never opened it," she hesitated. "Perhaps it's time someone did." Driven by a sudden surge of empathy, Sarah Mitchell requested access to Margaret's old letters and diaries. Jennifer Whitmore Chen had mentioned them during their tense video call, admitting they remained locked away in a cedar chest she'd inherited after her grandmother's passing. "They've never been opened since she died," Jennifer explained when Sarah arrived at her elegant New York apartment. "I always felt they weren't mine to read." The attorney's fingers trembled slightly as she produced an old-fashioned key from her desk drawer. Together, they approached the antique chest tucked away in Jennifer's home office. The hinges protested with a haunting creak as they lifted the heavy lid, releasing the musty perfume of aged paper and forgotten secrets. Sarah felt a chill as she carefully lifted the first leather-bound volume. The weight of history, both documented and hidden, pressed against her palms. Jennifer watched from across the room, arms crossed protectively over her chest, as if bracing herself for whatever revelations might emerge. "Take your time," the historian reassured her. I'll be respectful. The diaries spanned decades. Margaret's handwriting evolving from the confident loops of youth to the shakier script of her later years. Sarah's trained eyes quickly identified patterns. Certain entries were written with greater pressure, the ink sometimes blotted where Margaret had hesitated. On a page dated 3 months after the wedding photograph, Sarah found the first cryptic reference. The man behind the stone, visited today. No one must know. The shadow must remain where it belongs. The man behind the stone, Sarah murmured, making notes. Further entries grew increasingly guarded. William's shadow grows longer with each passing year. One passage read, "We must never speak his name outside these pages." Each entry felt like a plea for silence, yet Sarah sensed something more beneath the cautious words, a desperate, coded cry for understanding. Margaret had clearly carried this burden alone, documenting it only in these private pages where she could safely express her conflicted emotions. "Did you find something?" Jennifer asked, finally approaching. Sarah looked up from the diary. "Your grandmother was protecting someone, possibly William. These entries suggest he didn't die in that explosion." Jennifer's face paled. "That's impossible." "Maybe not," Sarah replied gently. "These diaries might be the key to understanding what really happened to your great-uncle and why your family kept it secret for so long." The cedar chest seemed to exhale its century-old secrets into the room, connecting the two women through a mystery neither had anticipated unraveling. Sarah Mitchell's fingers traced the elegant loops of Margaret Whitmore's handwriting, feeling a connection across time as she deciphered the faded ink. The diary entries had been cryptic until now, but this particular passage made her breath catch in her throat. Written on the date of the wedding captured in the photograph, Margaret had penned, "He came as a ghost, but left as a brother." The historian sat back in her chair, the implications washing over her like ice water. William Whitmore hadn't perished in that laboratory explosion, as every historical record claimed. He had survived, and most shockingly, had deliberately returned to witness a family milestone. Hiding in plain sight among the wedding guests. "My God," Sarah whispered to the empty archive room. The photograph wasn't merely documenting a celebration, it had captured a calculated reappearance, a man stepping briefly out of his fabricated death to reconnect with the family that publicly mourned him. Her hands trembled as she returned to the wedding image. The man's positioning now seemed deliberate rather than coincidental, close enough to be present, yet shrouded by the column's shadow, his face visible only from certain angles. William had choreographed his appearance with painful precision. Sarah flipped through more pages, finding additional cryptic references. "W sends his regards from the other side," one entry noted. Another mentioned the phantom at Christmas dinner. Each mention was carefully obscured, as if Margaret feared someone might read her private thoughts. The diary revealed a pattern of secret meetings and coded correspondence between the siblings. Margaret had become William's lifeline to the family he'd abandoned, carrying the weight of his secret through decades of Pittsburgh social events and family gatherings. Sarah reached for her telephone, then hesitated. James Hamilton would want to know immediately. This confirmation would electrify his research into the industrial dynasties. Yet something held her back. The professor's academic ambition might steamroll the human element of this discovery. Instead, she photographed the crucial pages with her device, ensuring she had evidence before returning the diary to its protective sleeve. The Whitmore legacy, which had seemed so straightforward in the history books, was unraveling before her eyes, revealing a tapestry of deception, loyalty, and sacrifice that spanned generations. Sarah gazed at the wedding photograph again. The joyful couple on the church steps, the gathered family members in their finery, and William, the ghost who wasn't a ghost, watching from the shadows. How many other historical photographs held similar secrets? How many official narratives were convenient fictions? One thing was certain: the Whitmore family had orchestrated one of the most elaborate deceptions in Pittsburgh's history, and Sarah now held the key to unraveling it all. James Hamilton paced around Sarah Mitchell's cramped office at the Carnegie Library, his excitement palpable as he gestured at the photographs spread across her desk. "This is groundbreaking, Sarah. We need to publish immediately," he insisted, adjusting his glasses. A presumed dead heir to one of Pittsburgh's greatest steel fortunes, secretly alive and photographed at his own sister's wedding. The academic community will be stunned. Sarah ran her fingers along the edge of the faded wedding photo, her thoughts drifting to Jennifer Whitmore Chen's face during their video call. The pain in the attorney's eyes had been unmistakable. "I'm not sure it's that simple," she countered. "These aren't just historical figures we're talking about. There are real people, living descendants, who will be affected by what we reveal." James stopped pacing and leaned across the desk. "But that's precisely why this matters. The Whitmore fortune shaped this entire city. If William faked his death, every historical account of Pittsburgh's industrial development needs revision." "And what about Jennifer?" Sarah asked quietly. "She's only just learning that her family's entire narrative might be built on deception. Shouldn't we consider what this will do to her?" The professor straightened, frustration evident in his posture. "Our responsibility is to historical truth, not to protecting the feelings of wealthy families who've benefited from carefully crafted myths." Their voices echoed through the archive room as the debate intensified. Sarah stood, matching her colleagues' intensity. "History isn't just about facts and dates, James. It's about people. Jennifer trusted us with her grandmother's diaries. We owe her some consideration before we turn her family into tomorrow's sensational headline." James threw up his hands. "3 universities have funded our research. The academic community expects results, not sentimentality." Sarah could see the ambition driving him, the books, the speaking engagements, the prestige that would come with such a discovery. Meanwhile, she couldn't shake the image of Jennifer sitting alone in her New York apartment, surrounded by generations of family secrets suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. "I'm not saying we hide the truth," Sarah clarified, her voice softening. "I'm saying we approach it with care. Give Jennifer time to process what this means for her family." The tension between them hung in the air, like the dust particles dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the library windows. Their partnership, once built on shared curiosity and respect, now revealed a fundamental difference in priorities. "1 week," James finally conceded, though his expression remained hard. "Then I'm moving forward, with or without your blessing." Sarah nodded, knowing this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict between academic ambition and human compassion, between historical record and living memory. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed police report. 3 separate witness statements described a man matching William Whitmore's appearance in Pittsburgh just weeks after his supposed death. Even more intriguing, similar sightings were documented in Chicago 6 months later. She cross-referenced the dates with the Whitmore family calendar she had reconstructed from Margaret's diaries. "James, look at this," she called to Professor Hamilton, who was examining other documents across the reading room. These sightings coincide perfectly with Margaret's engagement party and later her wedding." James adjusted his glasses and leaned over her shoulder. "He couldn't stay away from the milestone moments," he murmured. "The pull of family was too strong." The historian spread the documents across the table, creating a timeline that painted a startling picture. William hadn't simply disappeared. He had orbited his family from a careful distance. present yet invisible at their most significant moments. A notation in the margin of one report caught her attention. Witness believes subject paid for lodging with gold coins. Unusual. Sarah dug deeper, interviewing elderly residents whose parents had worked in the steel industry. One 92-year-old man, the son of a mill worker, recalled his father's stories about a mysterious Mr. Morrison who would appear at the workers' tavern every few months. "Oh, Dad said this Morrison fellow always paid with gold pieces," the elderly man told her, his rheumy eyes distant with memory. "Dressed too fine for our neighborhood, spoke like he had education but tried to hide it. Dad always figured him for a man running from something." The church records proved even more revealing. Sarah tracked down the son of a deacon who had served at the Methodist church where Margaret was married. The deacon had confided to his son about a strange occurrence during the ceremony. "My father swore until his dying day that William Whitmore himself slipped into the back pew during Miss Margaret's wedding," the man told Sarah over the telephone. Father recognized him immediately, had seen him dozens of times before the accident, but when he approached after the service, the man was gone. These fragments of memory and official record formed a constellation of evidence that William had maintained a ghostly presence in his family's life. The pattern suggested not a man who had fled entirely, but one who couldn't bear to sever all ties. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. If William had risked exposure to witness his sister's wedding, what else might he have risked to remain connected to the family that believed him dead? The Mr. Morrison lead sent Sarah Mitchell on a 3-hour train ride to Chicago, where she found herself standing before a dilapidated brick building with faded lettering still visible above the door, Morrison Photography Studio. The establishment had been shuttered for decades, its windows boarded and its entrance chained, yet it held answers she desperately needed. County records showed that Walter Morrison had owned the studio until his sudden death in 1903, exactly 2 days before William Whitmore's supposed fatal laboratory explosion. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, clutching her notebook as pedestrians hurried past, oblivious to the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. "The timing can't be coincidental," she whispered to herself, pulling out her phone to call James. The professor answered on the second ring, his voice tinged with excitement when she shared her discovery. 2 days is perfect," James Hamilton replied. "Just enough time for William to travel from Chicago to Pittsburgh and stage his own death." Sarah leaned against the building's cold exterior, her mind racing. What if William knew Walter? What if he somehow arranged to take over his identity after Walter died? Or what if Walter never existed at all? James countered. The Whitmores had enough money and influence to create a paper trail for a fictional photographer. Sarah shivered, not from the wind, but from the implications. Could William Whitmore have orchestrated such an elaborate deception? The historian in her recognized the pattern. Wealthy families throughout history had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect their reputations and legacies. Through a crack in one of the boarded windows, Sarah glimpsed dusty shelves and the ghostly outline of what might have been a camera stand. She imagined William stepping into this space, shedding his privileged past and adopting the life of an itinerant photographer. The steel baron's heir becoming a chronicler of ordinary lives. There was poetry in that transformation. She spent the afternoon in the Chicago Public Records office, piecing together Walter Morrison's sparse history. The man had appeared in city directories only 3 years before his death, with no family connections or previous residences listed. His death certificate cited heart failure, signed by a doctor whose name appeared nowhere else in city records. "It's too clean," Sarah told Jennifer during their evening call. "Walter Morrison feels like a character someone invented." Jennifer Whitmore Chen remained silent for a long moment before responding. My grandmother once told me that the greatest gift is a second chance at life. I never understood what she meant. As Sarah boarded the evening train back to Pittsburgh, she couldn't shake the image of William slipping into another man's life, aided by his sister's devotion and his family's vast resources. The wedding photograph now seemed less a historical curiosity and more a daring act of defiance. William Whitmore hiding in plain sight, unable to resist witnessing his sister's most important day. The late afternoon sun filtered through the grime-coated windows of the Whitmore estate's attic as Sarah Mitchell carefully navigated between stacks of forgotten belongings. Jennifer Whitmore Chen had finally relented after days of gentle persistence, granting Sarah access to this time capsule of family history. The historian's footsteps echoed on the worn wooden floorboards, stirring dust motes that danced in the slanting light. "My mother never allowed anyone up here," Jennifer said, lingering by the narrow staircase. "She claimed it was structurally unsound, but I always suspected there was more to it." Sarah nodded, her attention already captured by the maze of artifacts surrounding them. Tarnished picture frames, outdated clothing, and furniture from another era created a labyrinth of memories. The air felt heavy with secrets, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a faded quilt, sat an iron-bound trunk with the Whitmore crest embossed on its weathered lid. Sarah's heart quickened as she approached it, sensing its importance without knowing why. The attorney watched from a distance, arms crossed protectively across her chest, as Sarah knelt before the trunk. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the heavy lock. Jennifer handed over a ring of skeleton keys she'd found in her grandmother's belongings. "If it's meant to be opened, one of these should work." The third key clicked into place, and the mechanism groaned in protest after decades of disuse. Sarah lifted the lid slowly, revealing layers of carefully preserved memories. Beneath several leather-bound albums and a christening gown yellowed with age, she found what she'd been hoping for, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, each sealed with the distinctive Whitmore family crest. With trembling fingers, Sarah gently untied the ribbon. The first envelope contained a letter dated just 3 months after William's supposed death. The handwriting was precise, yet hurried, as if written by someone afraid of discovery. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "the light of Chicago is different from our Pittsburgh, harsher, yet somehow more forgiving of a man's past indiscretions." Letter after letter revealed an ongoing correspondence between William and his sister, spanning years after his reported demise. They wrote of loneliness, of longing for family, of coded meetings at train stations, and of near discoveries. William, now living as photographer Walter Morrison, had maintained his connection to Margaret through these secret communications. "They knew," Sarah whispered, looking up at Jennifer. "Your grandmother knew he was alive all along." Jennifer sank onto a nearby trunk, her professional composure crumbling as she confronted this tangible evidence of her family's deception. "What else haven't they told me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the settling of the old house around them. Sarah Mitchell spread the yellowed letters across the library table, carefully arranging them in chronological order. The faded ink and delicate paper told a story far more complex than she had initially imagined. William Whitmore, presumed dead for over a century, had reinvented himself as Walter Morrison, a traveling photographer who documented America's Industrial Revolution from Chicago to Pittsburgh and beyond. He was hiding in plain sight, Sarah whispered to herself, tracing her finger over a photograph of steel mills signed with the distinctive W.M. monogram. The images were remarkable, factories belching smoke, immigrant workers with weathered faces, and the skeletal frames of skyscrapers rising from urban landscapes. The correspondence revealed an elaborate financial arrangement. The Whitmore family had established a trust that provided William with quarterly payments, ensuring he maintained a comfortable lifestyle while wandering the country with his camera. One letter from 1912 detailed a deposit of $500, a small fortune at the time, with instructions to purchase new photographic equipment. Margaret's words to her brother were particularly revealing. "Mother asks about you in roundabout ways," she had written in 1910. "I tell her only that you are well, though the lie grows heavier each year." The historian could feel the weight of Margaret's burden in every carefully penned line. What struck Sarah most was the emotional toll of William's self-imposed exile. While he documented America's transformation through his lens, he remained forever separated from his own transformation into husband, father, or respected family patriarch. Instead, he lived as a ghost, appearing at family events only as a stranger in the background, capturing moments he could never truly be part of. Margaret's letters ached with unresolved longing. "I saw your face at Cousin Eleanor's wedding," she wrote in 1915. "You stood so close, yet I could not embrace you. This secret eats at my soul daily." Another letter confessed her terror when a distant relative commented on how the photographer's eyes reminded her of the Whitmore line. Sarah organized the correspondence into protective sleeves, handling each piece as the precious historical artifact it was. These weren't just family letters. They were evidence of an elaborate deception that had preserved the Whitmore reputation while condemning William to a life of shadows. James Hamilton would see this as academic gold, but Sarah felt the human cost in every word. William had escaped scandal only to live as a perpetual outsider, while Margaret carried the burden of his secret through her entire life. The letters revealed not just a hidden identity, but the steep price both siblings had paid for their deception. Sarah Mitchell sat back in her chair at the Carnegie Library. Staring at a bundle of yellowed letters she discovered tucked inside a false bottom of Margaret's cedar chest. The handwriting was unmistakable, William Whitmore's elegant script addressing someone he called only "my dearest E." As she pieced together the fragments, Sarah uncovered the most explosive revelation yet. William's disappearance hadn't been merely about escaping legal consequences. He had been entangled in a passionate affair with Elizabeth Holloway, the wife of Richard Holloway, owner of Keystone Steel, the Whitmores' fiercest business rival. "My God," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she read William's desperate pleas. This would have destroyed both families. The letters revealed a romance that had blossomed during industry gatherings, continued through clandestine meetings at a small hotel near the river, and eventually spiraled into an impossible situation. Elizabeth had become pregnant, and Richard Holloway, known for his volatile temper and vindictive nature, had begun to suspect. Sarah found a newspaper clipping from February 1903 reporting that Elizabeth Holloway had departed for extended treatment at a sanitarium in Switzerland. The timing aligned perfectly with William's laboratory accident just weeks later. The historian pieced together the devastating truth. William had faked his death not only to escape scandal, but to protect Elizabeth and their unborn child. The Whitmore family, understanding the catastrophic implications for both industrial empires, had orchestrated the elaborate deception. If this had come to light, Sarah murmured to herself, the Holloways would have been ruined by scandal, and the Whitmores branded as homewreckers. The steel partnerships would have collapsed. She found a telegram from Margaret to William, dated 3 months after his disappearance, as safely delivered of daughter, child placed with family in Boston. Holloway suspects nothing. Remain hidden. The weight of this secret pressed on Sarah's chest. This wasn't merely academic history. It was a human tragedy that had altered the course of multiple lives. William hadn't just abandoned his identity. He had abandoned his child. Sarah carefully photographed each document before returning them to their hiding place. The urgency of William's vanishing act now made perfect sense. The stakes had been unimaginably high, not just reputations and fortunes, but lives and bloodlines had hung in the balance. This revelation explained why the Whitmore family had maintained such rigid silence for generations. The scandal would have been devastating in 1903, and even a century later, it could still send shockwaves through Pittsburgh's oldest families. Sarah closed her notebook, suddenly understanding Margaret's cryptic warning about stories best left buried, some secrets cut across generations, their consequences rippling through time like stones dropped in still water. James Hamilton couldn't contain his excitement any longer. The academic in him saw this discovery as the crowning achievement of his career, a revelation that would rewrite Pittsburgh's industrial history. Without consulting Sarah Mitchell, he arranged a discreet meeting with Rebecca Winters, a journalist at the Pittsburgh Chronicle, known for her aggressive reporting style. I can't give you everything yet," James told Rebecca over coffee at a small cafe 3 blocks from the Carnegie Library. "But imagine a steel dynasty built on a foundation of lies. The Whitmore legacy isn't what anyone thinks." When Sarah discovered what he'd done, her face flushed with anger. She cornered him in his university office, slamming the door behind her. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Jennifer trusted us with her family's story." "This isn't just academic fodder, James. These are real people with real lives." The professor leaned back in his leather chair, unfazed. "History belongs to everyone, Sarah. The Whitmores don't own the truth just because it's inconvenient." "But we don't have the complete picture yet," Sarah countered, pacing across his office. "What if we're wrong? What if there's more to William's story than we understand?" James stood up, his patience wearing thin. "We have enough. The photograph, the coroner's report, Margaret's diaries, it's all there. This could be the publication that defines both our careers." "I didn't start this to advance my career," Sarah shot back. "Jennifer opened her grandmother's private writings to us. She deserves a say in how we present this." Their voices echoed down the hallway as the argument intensified. A student passing by quickened her pace, eyes downcast. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment," James said, his tone condescending. "This is historical research, not family therapy." Sarah slammed her palm on his desk, rattling his collection of antique paperweights. "That's it. Either we agree on an approach that respects the living while honoring the truth, or I'll take control of the narrative myself." James's expression hardened. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Sarah challenged, her eyes unwavering. "I have copies of everything. I can publish my own findings. Acknowledge your contributions and still handle this with the sensitivity it deserves." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, transforming their partnership into something fragile and uncertain. Neither historian backed down, both convinced their approach served the higher purpose. Outside, rain began to fall on Pittsburgh, the same rain that had fallen for over a century, washing away some secrets while preserving others beneath the city's steel-forged surface. Jennifer Whitmore. Chen sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that had remained sealed since her mother's passing 3 years ago. The attorney's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid from a weathered metal container. The scent of old paper and ink wafted up, carrying with it memories of a childhood spent in the shadow of unspoken family rules. "I found something," she told Sarah over the phone, her voice a mixture of apprehension and wonder. "Mother never let anyone touch these financial records. Now I understand why." 2 days later, Sarah Mitchell arrived at Jennifer's New York apartment, where the descendant of the Whitmore dynasty laid out a leather-bound ledger on her glass coffee table. The historian carefully turned the brittle pages, her breath catching as the pattern emerged. Every quarter, Sarah whispered, tracing the neat columns with her fingertip. For over 40 years, the ledger documented regular deposits into an account belonging to W. Morrison, beginning shortly after William's supposed death in the laboratory explosion. The payments continued well into the 1950s, long after most people would have expected William to be dead from natural causes. The amounts increased over time, Jennifer noted, pointing to later entries. Adjusted for inflation, perhaps? Sarah nodded, mentally calculating the modern equivalent. These weren't just survival funds. The family was ensuring he lived comfortably. The staggering sums represented a significant portion of the Whitmore fortune, carefully disguised as business expenses and charitable contributions. More telling were the occasional notes in the margins. Special occasion, beside a larger sum coinciding with William's original birth date. And medical, next to several substantial withdrawals in the 1930s. Everyone knew, Jennifer said, her voice hollow with realization. My grandmother, her parents, even the family accountants, they all maintained this fiction for decades. Sarah gently closed the ledger. It wasn't just Margaret protecting her brother. This was a coordinated family effort across generations. Jennifer paced the room, her corporate attorney composure cracking under the weight of revelation. I grew up believing we were honest people, principled. Now I discover my entire family history is built on elaborate deception. Or loyalty, Sarah suggested quietly. Perhaps extraordinary loyalty. The attorney paused by the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. Do you think he was worth it? This man they all protected? Sarah considered the question carefully. The fact that they continued supporting him long after the scandal would have faded suggests they thought so. Jennifer turned, determination replacing the shock in her eyes. There must be more. If they kept financial records, what else did they preserve? Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she carefully removed the antique silver frame from the wedding photograph. Something about its weight had always seemed off. Turning it over, she noticed tiny screws holding the backing in place that appeared newer than the century-old frame itself. Curiosity piqued. She gently loosened them with her museum-grade tools. The backing separated with a soft pop, revealing a yellowed slip of paper tucked into the frame's edge. On it, in faded but elegant script, were 7 words, "You will find me where the light bends." Sarah's heart raced. The phrase matched exactly a cryptic line from Margaret Whitmore's diary, one she had dismissed as poetic rambling until now. She immediately called Jennifer Whitmore Chen in New York. The attorney sounded exhausted when she answered, the weight of her family's unraveling history evident in her voice. I found something, Sarah explained, describing the hidden message. I think it refers to the stained glass window in your family's church. Margaret mentioned it repeatedly. A long silence followed. My grandmother always insisted we sit beneath that window during service, Jennifer finally said. I never understood why. After a day of deliberation, Jennifer gave her reluctant blessing. Just be careful with whatever you find. Some ghosts don't rest easily. The Methodist Church stood like a sentinel on Pittsburgh's east side, its stone facade weathered by a century of industrial smoke and changing seasons. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden doors, her footsteps echoing in the empty sanctuary. Afternoon light filtered through the magnificent stained glass window, a depiction of Jacob's ladder with angels ascending to heaven. As she approached, the colored light streamed across the empty pews, casting prismatic patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with life. Sarah stood transfixed, watching how the light bent and refracted through the colored glass, creating patterns on the floor that almost formed words. Following her instinct, she examined the ornate wooden panel beneath the window. Unlike the others surrounding it, This one had nearly invisible seams at its edges. Pressing gently along its border, she felt a mechanism give way. The panel slid aside, revealing a small, leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. The historian removed it with reverent care, recognizing the Whitmore family crest embossed on its cover. Opening to the first page, she saw the name William Whitmore inscribed in the same hand as the note in the frame. Sarah sank into a nearby pew, the colored light washing over the pages as she began to read the final testament of a man the world had believed dead for over a century. The pages of William Whitmore's journal trembled in Sarah Mitchell's hands. Yellowed with age, the handwriting slanted urgently across the paper as if the author had been racing against time itself. "I orchestrated my own demise," William had written. "There was no other choice left to me." The historian's breath caught as she read William's meticulous account of that fateful night. He described slipping into his laboratory after midnight, carefully arranging chemicals that would ensure a controlled explosion, devastating enough to destroy evidence, but contained enough to spare the surrounding buildings. The plan had been months in the making, coordinated with Walter Morrison, a struggling photographer who had agreed to disappear in exchange for enough money to support his ailing mother for life. "Morrison died of natural causes 2 days before our planned exchange," William wrote. "It was as if fate itself handed me his identity." He detailed how he had placed Morrison's body in the laboratory, ensuring the signet ring would survive as the only means of identification. The explosion had gone exactly as planned, leaving nothing but ashes and questions. Sarah turned the brittle pages with trembling fingers. William's words painted a portrait of a man torn between worlds, watching his own funeral from the shadows, boarding a westbound train as Walter Morrison while his family wept over an empty casket. His descriptions of learning photography, of documenting America's industrial revolution through a borrowed lens, revealed a man finding unexpected purpose in his second life. "The hardest part," he confessed, "was standing in the background of Margaret's wedding, knowing I could never embrace her, never dance with my sister on her happiest day." The photograph that had started Sarah's investigation had been William's momentary weakness, a desperate need to be present, if only as a ghost, in his family's most important moments. The journal's final pages contained admissions of guilt that spanned decades. William wrote of watching his nieces and nephews grow from afar, of the crushing loneliness that came with his freedom, and of Margaret's unwavering loyalty despite the burden he had placed upon her. His final entry ended with words that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Let my story be told only if it brings peace. I have already cost my family too much." Sarah closed the journal, overwhelmed by the weight of William's confession. She wiped tears from her cheeks, feeling the full gravity of the secret she now possessed. This wasn't merely historical evidence, it was a family's pain preserved in ink and paper, entrusted to her judgment after a century of silence. Sarah Mitchell and Jennifer Whitmore Chen sat across from each other in the restored study of the Whitmore mansion. Afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished oak floor. The air hung heavy with anticipation, and the rich scent of old leather-bound books that lined the walls, silent witnesses to a century of family secrets. "This is everything I've found," Sarah said, carefully arranging the documents on the antique desk between them. The historian had meticulously organized her evidence: William's journal, the wedding photograph in its silver frame, Margaret's tear-stained letters, and the bank ledgers showing decades of payments to a man who shouldn't have existed. Jennifer's fingers trembled as she reached for her great-uncle's journal. Her eyes, already brimming with tears, scanned the faded handwriting. His words, they sound so much like my grandmother's, the same cadence, the same way of seeing the world. Sarah nodded, watching the attorney process the weight of history unfolding before her. The connection between the two women had evolved from cautious professional courtesy to something deeper, a shared guardianship of a truth too complex for simple judgment. "He wasn't a villain," Jennifer whispered, tracing William's signature. "He was just desperate and afraid." "People rarely fit into the neat categories history assigns them," Sarah replied, her voice gentle. "Your family protected him out of love, not malice." The corporate attorney stood and walked to the window, her silhouette framed against the sprawling grounds where generations of Whitmores had lived their public lives while harboring their private truths. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. "If we reveal everything," Jennifer said, turning back to face Sarah, "it won't just rewrite history books. It will change how every living Whitmore understands themselves and their inheritance." Sarah nodded, feeling the full weight of her research. "And if we bury it again, we become part of the conspiracy of silence." The historian thought of James Hamilton, waiting impatiently for their decision, his academic ambition pushing against her more nuanced approach. She thought of Margaret's diaries, filled with decades of longing and protection. "We stand at a crossroads," Sarah said, rising to join Jennifer by the window. "Between truth and mercy, between history and family." Jennifer wiped a tear from her cheek. "Is there no middle path?" The two women stood side by side, looking out at the estate that had been built on steel, fortune d'art, and carefully guarded secrets. The harrowing choice before them would determine not just William's legacy, but their own place in the unfolding story of the Whitmore name. After weeks of intense deliberation, Jennifer Whitmore Chen sat at her mahogany desk in her New York office, carefully reviewing the statement she had drafted. The weight of a century-old family secret pressed on her shoulders as she made her final decision. With a deep breath, she released a public statement acknowledging that some stories are more complicated than they seem, carefully threading the needle between transparency and protection. "The Whitmore legacy has always been one of innovation and resilience," her statement read. "We recognize that history is rarely as straightforward as it appears in textbooks." The attorney had chosen her words meticulously, honoring both the truth and her family's dignity. Sarah Mitchell was granted permission to publish an academic article in the Journal of American Historical Studies. The historian crafted a piece that revealed the ambiguities in William Whitmore's death records and hinted at his possible survival, but deliberately omitted the most intimate details of his forbidden romance and the family's active role in maintaining his secret identity. "We're preserving the essence of what happened without turning private pain into public spectacle," Sarah explained to James Hamilton over coffee at a small cafe near the Carnegie Library. "The historical record will be more accurate, but not at the expense of destroying lives." James drummed his fingers on the table, clearly frustrated. "We could have written the definitive account," he said, his academic ambition still evident in his voice. "This feels like half measures." "It's not half measures," Sarah countered. "It's human decency. These aren't just historical figures. They have descendants who are still alive." The professor sighed, looking down at the photographs spread between them. After a long pause, he nodded. "I suppose some mysteries deserve their dignity," he conceded. "And the article will still challenge the accepted narrative about the Whitmore fortune." Their compromise allowed the academic community to reassess the historical record without sensationalizing the personal tragedy. Jennifer provided the library with digitized copies of selected letters and photographs, carefully curated to support the scholarly work while protecting the most vulnerable aspects of her family's story. When the article was finally published, it sent ripples through historical circles without the tsunami of scandal that might have engulfed the Whitmore name. The telephone in Sarah's office rang constantly with colleagues eager to discuss the implications. while James found himself invited to speak at conferences about historical methodology and ethics. "You were right," James admitted to Sarah weeks later, as they reviewed the respectful but enthusiastic response to their work. "Sometimes the human cost matters more than academic glory." Sarah simply nodded, knowing they had found the rare balance between truth and compassion that both history and humanity deserved. The story broke like wildfire across academic circles. Sarah Mitchell's carefully crafted article in the Journal of American Historical Studies sent ripples through the historical community, with scholars from Harvard to Stanford reaching out for more details about the Whitmore revelation. What she had presented was just enough. Tantalizing fragments of evidence suggesting William Whitmore might have survived his supposed death without exposing the full, raw truth that would have devastated Jennifer's family. "Your inbox must be exploding," James Hamilton remarked during their first civil conversation in weeks. The professor had ultimately respected Sarah's decision, though his initial disappointment had been palpable. "The Pittsburgh Historical Society called me 3 times yesterday." Sarah nodded, watching students pass by the university cafe window. "It's strange. I've spent my career hunting for historical truth. But this is the first time I've deliberately left parts in shadow." Throughout Pittsburgh, the wedding photograph became something of a local legend. The Carnegie Library created a special exhibition featuring the image, drawing crowds who peered intently at the mysterious figure lurking behind the column. The city's old money families, descendants of coal and steel fortunes, whispered at charity galas about what other secrets might be hidden in their own ancestral portraits. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a feature titled "The Man Who Wasn't There," exploring how a single photograph had challenged established historical narratives. Television documentaries followed, with Sarah carefully navigating interviews, honoring her promise to Jennifer while still advancing historical understanding. For Sarah herself, the case had transformed her. Each night before sleep, the faces from the photograph visited her. William's knowing eyes, the bride's innocent smile. The assembled guests who had no idea they were participating in an elaborate charade. She found herself studying strangers, family albums with new intensity, wondering what untold stories lurked in the backgrounds of seemingly ordinary moments. "Do you regret not telling everything?" Jennifer asked during one of their monthly calls, her voice carrying across the miles from her New York apartment. Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she finally answered. "History isn't just about facts, it's about understanding the human experience. Sometimes that means respecting the complexity." The wedding photograph now hung in Sarah's office, a reminder that every image captured only a fragment of reality, that behind every historical certainty might lurk a shadow narrative waiting to be discovered. And somewhere in attics and archives across America, countless other secrets remained, patient as dust, waiting for someone curious enough to look beyond the obvious. As winter melted into spring, Sarah Mitchell found herself returning to the Whitmore estate more frequently. What had begun as a historian's quest had transformed into something deeper, a shared journey between 2 women connected by a century-old secret. Jennifer Whitmore Chen had renovated the old library where they often met. The afternoon light streaming through tall windows onto leather chairs where they would sit for hours. Sometimes they spoke of William and Margaret, other times of their own lives. The corporate attorney had softened her sharp edges, finding unexpected comfort in Sarah's company. "My grandmother would have liked you," Jennifer remarked one afternoon, pouring tea from a silver service that had witnessed generations of Whitmore conversations. She valued truth, even when she couldn't speak it herself. The academic paper Sarah published had caused precisely the ripples they had anticipated. enough to honor the historical record without exposing the raw wounds of the family's past. James Hamilton had eventually come around, acknowledging that some truths belonged as much to the living as to history. Their professional relationship had weathered the storm, though changed irrevocably by the choices they'd made. In the Carnegie Library, the wedding photograph now held a place of honor in a special exhibition on Pittsburgh's industrial families. Visitors would pause before it, studying the faces frozen in time, never fully knowing the complex story behind the man half hidden in shadow. Sarah often watched them from across the room, carrying the weight of knowing what they could only guess. The most meaningful outcome came 6 months after their discovery. When Jennifer established the Whitmore Historical Preservation Fund, not to bury truths, she explained to Sarah, but to ensure they're handled with the care they deserve. On the anniversary of their first meeting, the two women visited the Methodist church where the wedding had taken place a century earlier. The stained glass window, where the light bends, cast colored shadows across the wooden pews. Jennifer placed a single white rose beneath it, a quiet acknowledgement of William's journey. "Do you think he found happiness?" Jennifer asked, her voice echoing softly in the empty church. Sarah thought of the photographs William had taken across America, documenting a changing nation through the lens of a man who had changed himself. "I think he found peace," she answered. "Sometimes that's enough." As they walked out into the Pittsburgh sunshine, Sarah realized that history was never truly finished. It lived on in relationships, in questions answered and unanswered, in secrets revealed and those still waiting to be discovered. William Whitmore's story had found its rightful place, not forgotten, but understood, with all its complicated humanity intact.